Revolutionary theory is required.
We owe it to ourselves. Again, I am talking as though we're serious about making revolution. I think that would be my assumption in any event. We owe it to ourselves to learn from the experience of others, to study that accumulated body of thought, which is not Holy Scripture, is not dogma, but is the summary of the living experience of revolutionary struggle, to see how that applies to us, understanding that there are certain universal truths that have already been developed in the course of revolutionary struggle, such as the necessity, ultimately, for armed struggle, or the leading role of a working class in making revolution in capitalist countries, and so on. A number of truths that have emerged which apply to all countries, and a number of particularities which apply to each country. So revolutionary theory is an indispensable aspect of making revolution. But if we say that, we should also say that the concrete application of revolutionary theory to concrete conditions in each particular country is absolutely indispensable. Revolutionary theory is not the parroting or repetition of slogans or quotations from textbooks. And I'm not opposed to reading those books and even using the quotations when appropriate. But a quotation never proved anything. It's its applicability that is important. One goes back to history to see whether or not it can shed some light on a particular situation. But to simply finger the rosary bead of dogma in the name of Marxism also does not make revolution. Concrete application and concrete practice are indispensable. Finally, the element which, in my view, ties all this together, all that I've run down about what is necessary in order to make revolution, how to make revolution, and that is one needs a revolutionary front in Vietnam. And many people have wondered, what is it that enabled the Vietnamese people to defeat U.S. imperialism? What is this remarkable characteristic that they had? And some people romanticize the Vietnamese people. Well, they're a special breed of people. They're supermen and superwomen and all kinds of things. They're not. They are ordinary people. And when we spoke to the editor of the leading newspaper in Hanoi, the editor of the Nam Dam Daily, he put it very simply. He said, the Vietnamese people owe everything to the Vietnamese communists. We would be nothing without the leadership of the Vietnamese communists. Uncle Ho was not only
a jolly and moving patriotic figure. He was a Marxist-Leninist, the founder of the Indo-Chinese Communist Party. And it was the existence and work of that party that held that revolution together in the direst days of adversity. And there will be no revolution anywhere without the creation of a party, of a particular kind of party, of a party that understands the fundamental principles that I've been laying out here, the necessity for the kind of struggle that will be engaged in, a party that will be disciplined based on the principles of democratic centralism, which you can read up for yourself, I won't run down at this moment, and so on. That's why we say, in looking at the United States today, somebody says, well, what's the task of the left? We say the central task is to create such a party. We say it's not going to be created in the abstract, that it has to be developed along with the process of mass political struggle, but that we must make a scientific appraisal and say this is the key. Now, some people say that almost as though building a party were an end in itself, and that, of course, is not the case. Just as in the long run, even socialism is not the goal. Socialism, after all, does not solve all problems. Socialism is only the indispensable social tool that will enable us to solve problems. And similarly, from the point of view of making revolution, a party doesn't solve all problems. It is the indispensable tool for beginning to solve those problems. So that's why we say that's the central task at this moment in trying to move the revolutionary process forward. Okay, I'm going to stop there and turn it over to you to ask questions and your comments. Okay, I would trust that there's a couple of points that people would like to raise. Yes.
I couldn't agree more with almost everything you said, but I do have one point I wish to contend with you on, and that's your analysis of the USSR. And I think that the USSR has a lot of problems, but I would disagree with your analysis of the USSR as a capitalist country, either outright capitalist or a state capitalist country. I think that the problem in the USSR is that there's a privileged bureaucracy which runs states in its own interests, that it's not the case that USSR is a state capitalist nation. Now, you contend that, I think, that the USSR somehow became capitalist in some form or another about 15 years ago. And if you agree with what Lenin said in State and Revolution, well, it seems like you have to throw state and revolution out the window if you contend that, because there wasn't a violent struggle between classes in which there was a counter-revolution in which the capitalist class gained back power from the working class. I would contend that the working class is essentially still in power in the USSR, although there are some bureaucratic deformations. I think the proper, more reasonable position to take on the USSR is that it is a worker state, but a deformed worker state. I think that the conclusions that would lead you to would be that USSR, revolutionary socialists, should take the USSR side in struggles that it has with imperialist capitalist countries, but at the same time, the revolutionary socialists should point out the deformations in the USSR and call for a revolution by the masses and to overthrow the ruling bureaucratic castes. I was wondering, I of course remain amenable to reasonable persuasion, so I'd like to hear.
I don't imagine that the few remarks I'll make now will persuade you. I think it's an important question to study and come to a conclusion on, but it's not simply a theoretical question of what label we're going to pin on the Soviet Union. It's important for several reasons, and we at The Guardian do not take the view that capitalism has been fully and thoroughly restored in the Soviet Union. We say that capitalist class relations have emerged, and that, in effect, I guess what you call a bureaucratic elite has become a class of monopoly capitalists who exercise at this moment effective control over the means of production and the state machinery. It's an important question because it demonstrates the fact that socialism, once established, does not automatically continue to exist, that it must constantly not only be fought for, but that the class struggle goes on, and that the failure to pursue the class struggle under socialism precisely means that socialism can be defeated. Now, there's no point in going back to state and revolution or anything else. This is an unprecedented situation in the world. We'll have to write our own state and revolution to explain this phenomenon. And I think many people are studying that question from that point of view. But it's also an important question because the Soviet Union is not just some country off there that we can observe under a microscope for our own intellectual satisfaction. It plays a particular role in the world. And it's our view that in relation to Eastern Europe, for instance, and to some other areas of the world where it has increased its domination, that role is an imperialist role, that it exploits the working class in those countries as the ruling class in the Soviet Union exploits its own working class, and that the whole concept of seeing the necessity for people throughout the world to forge a united front against both superpowers understands that the Soviet Union plays the role of an imperialist superpower. Well, let's take another question. Yes?
You spoke to the role of war for imperialism. I wonder if you'd elaborate on the possibility of war today.
Well, there are two types of war that are very imminent in the world today. Imperialist war and revolutionary war. Imperialist war itself takes two forms. One is the war between rival imperialisms. The other is the counter-revolutionary war of aggression that imperialism wages against national liberation movements. The grave danger of imperialist war exists everywhere. That's why in all of these crises in the Middle East, you find the mobilization orders going out, standby orders, and so on. The conflict between these two rival superpowers is an extremely dangerous one, and one that will not be resolved simply by them trying to find an accommodation with each other. You know, before World War I broke out, there were all kinds of détentes between the rival imperialist countries. They had pacts galore. It all added up to nothing because there were fundamental conflicts of interest that impelled these systems to collide with each other. However, the situation in the world today is different in this respect, and that is imperialism is although very strong, is no longer the dominant trend. And in fact, the only way in which war can be prevented, meaning world war, world imperialist war, is precisely through the development and strengthening of the revolutionary wars now being conducted for national liberation, particularly in the Third World, but in other areas as well. It is the one process that can prevent, if anything could prevent, this ultimate collision between the two superpowers. There were two different ways of looking at the war in Vietnam. There were many people then, and still now, even including some who call themselves revolutionaries, who look at the war in Indochina simply as a war, an imperialist war. And for these people, they said, the most important thing we want is peace. But the people of Indochina were not fighting for peace. They were fighting for national liberation and for reunification of their country, which they understand is the only way in which peace can be achieved. If we simply put peace forward as an objective, removed from these other considerations, then we get no peace. In the Middle East today, no matter, even if Henry Kissinger had been able to achieve whatever he was out there trying to get accomplished, so long as, just to use one example, the national rights of the Palestinian people in the Middle East were denied, there would be no peace in the Middle East. be impossible to have. They would see to it themselves. So that the only way in which peace can be achieved is through the elimination of imperialism. That means that revolutionary war will be a characteristic of our time, and the view put forward today by the leaders of the Soviet Union in the name of socialism and revolution, that we now live in an age in which we can possibly have a warless world, is simply impossible. It's futile. Okay, other questions?
How important is the CIA in the maintenance of our imperialistic system? Do you think it's weakening?
The question is, how important is the CIA? It's obviously having its problems. I think, I spoke earlier about the fact that revolutionaries cannot rule out any means of struggle, both legal and illegal. And one of the reasons for saying that is that clearly the ruling class does not rule out any means of struggle, legal or illegal. And it is characteristic of the crisis of imperialism that it must more and more rely on means that are illegal even within its own system. That's why it violates its own laws, creates secret police, which, if the Constitution meant anything, you'd say, well, okay, it's all illegal and unconstitutional. And that obviously doesn't stop anything. Now we have this interesting phenomenon of exposures of all the secret police work, the CIA and the FBI and so on. In my opinion, what we're seeing is a process within the American ruling class whereby one particular wing of that ruling class is coming to have power, I think momentarily, but is having the upper hand. And that wing, which includes Mr. Rockefeller's personal president, Mr. Rockefeller's personal secretary of state, and a number of other agents of the Rockefeller interests, is a process in which the Rockefeller interests have become the single most powerful force within the American ruling class. And I think that in trying to strengthen its own rule within the U.S. ruling class, it is also trying to strengthen its rule over the agencies of the secret police. I think that that accounts to a great extent for some of these revelations about the CIA. And I think you know as well as I that there is a distinct limit to how much dirty linen is going to be washed in public. We're going to get a cosmetic job. They may even at some point disband the CIA and just reorganize it under another name. That will seem better because they're absolutely dependent on these kinds of operations. Yeah.
Are there any organizations in this country which you see as having the potential to be a national revolutionary party?
Well, on the left today, of course, we've seen over the last few years a very interesting and good development. 5 years ago, only a handful of people could really be described as Marxist-Leninists. Today, as I travel around the country, wherever I go, people say, oh yeah, I'm a Marxist-Leninist, I'm a Marxist-Leninist. Now, they aren't all, but the fact that they have to say they are is itself interesting. It means that there is a growing awareness that this is the direction in which the revolutionary movement has to move. A number of different organizations have come into being, each of them with the view of playing a role in creating a party. In our view, while within the membership of most of these organizations exist a good portion of the cadre who will eventually go into the making of a revolutionary party, we don't see that any particular organization has yet emerged which can say it has developed the political line or the ties with the masses and so on, where we can say, okay, this is the organization that we can all unite behind and follow. I think this is a process that's going to go on yet for some time to come, but I think also that we are much further ahead in that process than we were a year or two ago.
Since we're speaking in a food-producing state, I'd like to hear your analysis of the food crisis.
I come from a food-consuming place, you know. the food crisis on a world scale? It seems to me that this is one of the most telling reflections of the contradictions of the imperialist system. It is said that we now have the capacity to feed all the world's peoples. And probably, from a technical point of view, that's correct. I've heard the people who are revolutionaries say, all you old-fashioned Marxists, your theory comes out of the 19th century when we lived in a world of scarcity. We live in the era of post-scarcity. The fact is that the problem is not technology or capacity, and it is not population. What is holding back the process, what is creating starvation, is an outmoded set of economic and social relations, because so long as the production of food, as well as any other necessity, is dependent upon it being a profitable enterprise, then the problem will not be resolved. The profit system is at the heart of the food crisis. And it is only by the elimination of the profit system, it is only by eliminating profit as the reason for production rather than need and use that the food crisis can be solved. Certainly it must strike those of you in this state as the height of irony that the capitalist system, in order to resolve its economic crisis, fools around with such notions as paying people not to grow crops or artificial stimulants to hold back production and so on. Now, I can understand why that's done within the context of trying to live with the contradictions of this system. But if we have the capacity to grow the materials, if the world has the capacity to feed itself and isn't doing it, then we have to ask ourselves, what's holding it back? And so long as it is production for profit rather than production for use, we're not going to solve that problem. Yes?
As the struggle in Cambodia and Indochina as a whole progresses, and a lot of the news stories have been stepped up, a lot of stories coming out of the Pentagon and things about refugees in Vietnam and the struggle in Cambodia and that. And it's very hard to get a real feeling for the situation because of how the bourgeois press sums it up for us. And it seems like you've just gotten back recently from North Vietnam, liberated areas, and probably talking to people, but also what's going on very close by. Maybe that you can give us some impressions about refugee figures and the situation.
Well, like you, I don't know any more about refugees than I read in the papers and see on the television. I would hope that also, like you, or you like me, we've both learned over the course of the last decade that newspaper headlines and stories that we read in our newspapers are really not the most reliable source of information. If you examine some of these refugee stories carefully, certain readily apparent contradictions come out. On the one hand, in order to try to minimize the disaster now overtaking the U.S.-dominated puppet regime, the stories say, the communists now have control over 10% of the population in South Vietnam, as if to say, 90% are still in the free world. At the same time, we hear reports of 500,000 to 1 million refugees on the roads. Now, the population of South Vietnam is 18 million. You do learn arithmetic here, I guess. That simple kind. And 10% of 18 million is 1,800,000. So that if the patriotic forces now control territory with a population of 1,800,000, it must strike somebody as a little bit hard to believe that something like a half to two-thirds of the population in those areas are leaving. There is absolutely no basis, historically or in fact, for an exodus of that kind. I frankly simply don't believe it. Now, one aspect of these refugee stories, which is most interesting, is You hear stories about the people buying their way onto helicopters, buying themselves rides and so on. Even in the midst of this disaster, somebody is around trying to earn a profit off of the defeat. That's the reality of the capitalist system. Selling tickets on the last plane out of Hue and selling them at black market prices. And you know who can buy that ticket, and you know the kind of story that person is going to tell when they get off of the plane. When we were in Vietnam in November and December, we met with people in the Provisional Revolutionary Government of South Vietnam, and this was before the current offensive. And they said, the situation for us is very favorable. The fact is that we hold the political and military initiative throughout the South. Now, if you just went by our newspapers, you would say, well, I wish they were true. I wish that was an accurate assessment, but maybe they're being a little over-optimistic. When they talk about provinces falling and so on, what is the reality? I mean, who ever heard of a situation in which 10 provinces are abandoned virtually without the firing of a shot? Why was that? Because the area actually controlled by the Saigon regime was minuscule. They controlled a handful of cities, enclaves, in a very large area already controlled by the patriotic forces. How else do you think all those troops could get close to those cities if they weren't supported by the people in the countryside? A viable administration existed before the current offensive in 50% of the territory of South Vietnam. The Provisional Revolutionary Government of South Vietnam, recognized by 40 to 50 countries throughout the world, is a viable administration, is a government, controlled large areas of land, and if you look at some of the more candid maps, you will see that the areas controlled by the Provisional Revolutionary Government are not simply north of the Central Highlands. They're throughout the Mekong Delta, and they go to within 40 to 50 miles of Saigon itself. So the abandonment of a few cities by the Saigon army means that they no longer could defend those cities, but they didn't have the rest of the province in the first place. And I think what we are learning today is, once again, the revolutionary forces in Vietnam have had the upper hand. They represent the aspirations of the people. They have the overwhelming support of a majority of the people. And the days of the Saigon regime clearly are numbered. There is no running away. Vietnam is going to be one country in the not-so-distant future, and the two regime is going to be a very dirty memory. Okay, other questions?
I'm sure you're familiar with the debate within the world proletarian movement on how exactly national liberation can come about for different countries. Some people, say that the working class has to align itself not only with peasantry and the petty bourgeoisie, but also with the progressive section of the capitalist class. On the other hand, you have people who say that all sections of the capitalist class in third world nations are so intimately bound with the world imperialist class that they cannot afford to fight with the working class against the imperialist class. And those people claim that the only way that real national liberation can come about is through a socialist revolution, that there's not going to be first a national revolution and then a socialist revolution. I think if you look at China and Cuba, for example, you see that they were both cases of the latter kind, where there in effect were socialist revolutions, although there was a lag in China between 1949 and 1953. At all times, the working class and peasantry had control of China during those times, and the same with Cuba. That it took a socialist revolution to actually have a nation liberated. I was wondering what your feeling on that debate is.
Yeah, I am familiar with that debate. The theory of two-stage revolution in third world countries, I think, has been proven over and over again to be the correct strategy for making revolution. You mentioned both Cuba and China. In Cuba, it was a patriotic war directed in the first place against U.S. imperialism and its puppets in the Batista regime that had the capacity for uniting the overwhelming majority of the Cuban people. It was, in that stage, a patriotic war of national liberation. It moved very quickly, in the course of some 2 years, to becoming a socialist revolution. Now, 2 years may not seem like a long time, but we're not measuring time. We are talking about strategy. In China, it took an even longer period of time. In China, their view is that they didn't really complete the first stage of the revolution until the beginning of the Cultural Revolution in the middle 60s. In fact, we know that in China, it was a patriotic war in which many in the national bourgeoisie, capitalists who had their own contradiction with imperialism, were won to the side of the revolution, and for a period of time after the revolution, the capitalists were even allowed to function as capitalists, and in time became absorbed into the state system as the social process proceeded. In Vietnam today, that theory of two-stage revolution is the central strategy of the Vietnamese communists. In the South, for instance, their immediate objective is not socialist revolution. Their immediate objective is defeating U.S. imperialism and the puppets in Saigon. Now, it is true that in third world countries, there is not going to be a very large section of the national bourgeoisie which can be won over to the cause of national liberation. At the same time, to the extent that that can be done, then that type of alliance, that type of patriotic united front, is a legitimate strategy to pursue. That's what they're doing in those struggles. The important thing is not whether or not there is an alliance between the working class and other classes, but who leads that alliance. And what the communists say is, in forging the united front, it is absolutely indispensable to work for the working class leadership of the alliance, that it is beyond the capacity of the national bourgeoisie to see through even the struggle for independence, although it can be united with in a patriotic cause. And I think that we see this elsewhere in third world countries, and that it is a very sound strategy. In fact, the opposite strategy, the strategy that says the struggle is immediately and directly for socialism, is one that historically has led to defeat in third world countries. Any other questions? Well, now all we got to do is go out and make revolution. Since we've answered all questions.
For those of you who'd like to talk with Erwin Silber, you're invited, anybody who wants to talk is invited over to David Alexander's and Iris Young's house on, it's 306 Hayward, which is the street that Boyd's is on. It's about 2 blocks south of Boyd's, 306. And don't forget the lecture tomorrow, or the slideshow and discussion tomorrow at noon in 205, 206 in this building on North Vietnam. So thank you for speaking.
Thank you for coming.